to get hydrated because you are stopping off at the card pool. I'm your host, Stu Galetta.
And I'm Kyle Robertson.
And today we are talking about our top 5 cards that we have loved and found so far from our Hidden Gem segments.
Well, we hope this makes a splash because this is our final dive into all of the sets that we've covered so far in Season 1 of the card pool. So, without further ado, let's start off this review with your number 5 card of all time so far, Stu.
All right, Kyle. Well, for my number 5, this one stole my heart in Invasion. It is Mage's Contest. Now, this is an instant that costs 3 mana, 1 generic, and double red. And it reads, you and target spell's controller bid life. You start the bidding with a high bid of 1. And in turn order, each player may top the high bid. The bidding ends with the high bid standing. The highest bidder loses life equal to the highest bid. If you win the bidding, counter that spell. If you're still with us after that wall of text, in short what this card does is it makes it so that red now has access to a counter spell. And what that means is that no one is going to expect this to come because who expects a counter spell in red? The only 2 things that I can truly think of are Red Elemental Blast and Pyroblast.
Well, that is absolutely true, Stu, but I would like to point out this card can be very risky to use. It can benefit you because other players could possibly end up in a bidding war that will drastically reduce one of their life totals, but also it can very easily backfire on you because if that happens and you don't win the bidding, you actually don't get to counter that spell. So it's kind of a difficult card to use effectively, but it is kind of an interesting option to see this out here, and I don't really see it played much at all.
Well, and you are completely correct with that, Kyle, but the one thing I really do like about this card is it does something that a lot of cards in which you have to pay life for are stuck with. You can exceed your life total in this bidding for how this card is worded. So inherently, if you have 10 life and the other player has 30, you can just punk them so this way they will stop at a point. Yes, you may lose the game because of it, or in turn, you can make it so that that card goes through, might not have even affected you in the first place, and they're down to 1, 2, 3 life. So this is very impactful. And actually, after using this card in my Jaya deck, it is just a powerhouse for when it goes off because yes, I might not always get it to go off, which you are right, but I always make them go and pay that cost, and they're never happy about it. Yes, they get the card to go through, but that cost is way, way steeper. With Pyroblast and Red Elemental Blast, both of those are conditional. It has to be blue. Yes, it can kill a blue permanent, but if you're trying to counter something that's completely hard-casted, this is really the only true option that's good for any scenario outside of just a blue-specific card. So that is something that really makes this card shine for me. And for you, Kyle, I see we are now going to your favorite plane in all of Magic.
Yes, indeed. Going back to Ravnica, or rather, Return to Ravnica, the set in particular, to talk about Vraska the Unseen. Now, this Planeswalker is 5 mana, 3 colorless, a green and a black, putting her firmly in the Golgari Guild there on Ravnica. And she has 3 abilities, as most Planeswalkers do, starting at 5 loyalty. +1 until your next turn, whenever a creature deals combat damage to Vraska, destroy that creature. -3, destroy target non-land permanent, or -7, put 3 1/1 black assassin creature tokens onto the battlefield. They each have, whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, that player loses the game. Wow, it really blows my mind that Vraska is only a $4 Planeswalker, even when she's pretty much the best one out there, in my opinion. She checks all the boxes that you would want for a Planeswalker. She has self-protection, and one of the best instances of self-protection in any Planeswalker, really, much better than just token producing. Automatic instant destruction of pretty much anything except a land, which is something that's almost unprecedented on most cards, not just Planeswalkers. And then also a built-in win condition. You usually expect Planeswalker ultimates to win you the game, and this one maybe sort of does it in not quite such a direct way because it does rely on producing a couple of tokens and having them deal combat damage, but it's still pretty cool, and there are still some pretty degenerate things you can do with it, with stuff like Parallel Lives.
Oh yeah, or even Doubling Season, which is always a classic example for any green Planeswalker. And I do love this one, except the only thing I really wish that this had is some sort of draw on it. I mean, we see it with all the Jaces. I think it's the only little thing that's niche on this, but I mean, come on, it really doesn't put it back in my book. It's just so serviceable once it hits the field. Literally, once you drop it, you can see see the ripples go across everyone's playmats because they instantly assess this as a threat. And that is really what you're saying here. And this is a card that is a threat. It is so serviceable. And for 5 loyalty starting, yeah, it meets all my check boxes too.
That +1 ability is just so insane to me too, because obviously one of the best ways to get rid of planeswalkers is to attack them with creatures. Whenever a creature attacks Vraska, you may get rid of Vraska, but your creature or more creatures are going to pay for it. Especially attacking with several small creatures, then you're going to lose them all if you attack Vraska after having used that +1 ability, so even more destruction. The only reason I think this doesn't see as much play as it might is because it doesn't really play into Black-Green's kind of theme of self-sacrificing or anything like that, but still, I think it should go in any Golgari deck pretty much, just because of the range of power you have available.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And also, to bring back the +1, there are a few ways to get around this if you have something to flat out destroy permanents, like we see with Beast Within, for example, in green. But I do love something else with this, in which there are 2 planeswalkers that come to mind that can initially just kill this planeswalker. Garruk Apex Predator, and also Nicol Bolas, the straight-up OG planeswalker. I love that flavor of just another planeswalker having the ability to take out another planeswalker. It fits into lore, it fits into the gameplay. It's pretty cool if you can have that scenario happen on the field. So I, Kyle, will also keep some of the black mana here for my number 4 pick, and we are going to Tempest, in which we found this gem. It's called Maddening Imp. It costs 3 mana, 2 generic, and a single black for a 1/1 flyer. And it reads with the tap effect, all non-wall creatures target opponent control attack this turn if able. At end of turn, destroy each of those creatures that did not attack. Use this ability only during your opponent's turn and only before combat. Back in our segment when we talked about this card, we also talked about how it has a very unique sense of its ruling because it hasn't been oracled. Most cards that are like this typically have the effect saying that if it's unaffected by summoning sickness. This is one of the few cards that I've ever found that doesn't give any regard to whether or not a creature has summoning sickness or not to attack. It just cares if it's a wall. And to be honest, in Commander, how often do you see walls? Like, there's a goofy wall tribal deck you can maybe do in Zedru, or maybe in Doran, who loves to have the big toughness over power. But for a card that's like literally 50 cents, this blows my mind for how much devastation it leaves in its wake.
I should note that this card has gotten a little bit weaker since it was created because the whole wall thing has kind of been changed over time to creatures with Defender, which opens up a long list of things that are good and yet are not walls. But anyway, as you said, Stu, this is pretty cool because mass destruction on creatures, you kind of see it on a few cards here and there, like Megetta the Lion, for example, is a legendary one I can think of, but you really don't see it all that often. And against creatures that don't have haste, this can mean a near combat lockdown because it immediately forces creatures to either attack or be destroyed. So if you have this out there and your opponent is still in the process of playing out their creatures, you can pretty much stop them as long as those creatures don't have haste or something like that. I should also note that red pretty much gets this kind of effect nowadays with forcing attacks, so you can force people into kind of awkward combat situations like attacking into a bunch of little death touch creatures, maybe like typhoid rats if we are sticking to black, and that can be a nightmare for some people.
Oh yeah, and I've actually used this card a lot in my Hirobi Death's Wail deck. Every time I played, I've never seen so much hate go to this card without it being a hate bear. Like, this is something that I never get to get off, but they always waste a counter spell or some sort of really solid board removal, or will pop like a Nevinyrral's Disc just in response to this card coming out because inherently they can't play their commander, especially if it doesn't have haste. It just creates that much fear on the board, and for just a little guy who can come out possibly even turn 2 and turn 3 start wrecking the board state, it is terrifying for any player facing this.
So leaving a specific plane now and taking a look at one of our supplementary sets, I'm actually looking at a Commander 2011 card for my number 4, and it's called Chaos Warp. This is a red instant that costs 2 generic and 1 red to play, so 3 mana. The owner of target permanent shuffles it into his or her library, then reveals the top card of their library. If it's a permanent card, they put it onto the battlefield. I'm kind of sticking with very simplistic cards for most of my top 5 here, Stu, but I think we can both agree that Chaos Warp is one quality card, even if it is kind of simplistic. And not even that simplistic, really, just because of it's such an odd effect. Unconditional removal is pretty rare, especially in red. Red has real problems dealing with a lot of different things, like enchantments being the biggest thing, sometimes even creatures, because damage doesn't necessarily kill every single creature. Even with the drawback that Chaos Warp has, unconditional removal of that kind in red, and yes, lands are included in this. It could basically be any permanent out there, unlike Vraska. The drawback most of the time as well doesn't usually end up being that bad. I've only had it backfire on me like a couple of times ever playing this card where I turned something decent into like an Ulamog, for example, and that's not a fun time.
Oh, it totally is, Kyle.
But most of the time, it doesn't end up being as bad as the problem that you just solved, so I think it's worth it.
Yes, you're 100% right, and this can whiff too as long as it isn't a permanent, and there's tons of decks out there that prefer instants and sorceries over a permanent, and those are like Storm decks, for example, or any deck that likes to have more of a pillow fort and basic forms of removal. And it's very serviceable for being just a number one red staple. This is, I think, the best red staple card, and I will never forget the time when you played this against me. I was kind of happy, kind of sad, because losing a great combo piece never feels good, but you always get the kind of risk and reward feel, like, all right, maybe it's like the lottery ticket. I'm going to scratch it off and I'm a jackpot winner. Most cases not, and you are right about that, and you definitely destroyed a lot of my plays. But every now and then I get the same card back or something better, and that feels good for everyone, because one, it's hilarious when that happens, and two, if you're sitting on the right side of the gun, you always feel a lot better.
This card used to be worth a lot of money, but with a number of reprints has since moved down to about the $3 price range, so pretty much anyone can pick it up these days, and that's yet another reason I love it. It's kind of like the red Beast Within also, as I see you having your notes about the card here, Stu. So I think Beast Within's probably, in the total summary, the better card because you know what you're getting in exchange for getting rid of a threat. But Chaos Warp can certainly turn out to be better in some cases because you may not give them anything back for it.
Oh, yeah. And also, one last thing to note, this is something that I like as a shining star towards Wizards, because this shows them actually taking initiative for the Commander crowd. They saw that something was missing in red, just mono red flat out, and they found a way to fill the void without making it too overpowered. And I think they did a really good job, and that whole set, they really did a lot of interesting mechanics with it, so kudos to them. Now, my number 3 is coming to a set we've recently reviewed, but I still can't help but fall in love with this card over and over again. It is called Pygmy Hippo, and this is from Visions. It costs 2 mana, and it's in Simic colors, meaning it is just a single green and a single blue for a 2/2 hippopotamus. And it reads, if Pygmy Hippo attacks and is not blocked, you may choose to have it deal no combat damage this turn, and if you do, defending player draws all mana from his or her lands, and then his or her mana pool is emptied. After combat, add that mana to your mana pool in colorless form. So this is a very strong, very serviceable card, which I would almost say is a hate bear without it being a hate bear for how much hate it really does draw as soon as you play it. It can do something that a lot of cards in Magic can't, in which it makes players tap lands for mana, and then it can siphon the mana. So inherently in the game of Magic, there are a decent amount of cards that make it so opponents do tap their lands in response to something. Now, however, they can in turn respond to that by tapping the lands and floating the mana and making it miss a trigger. There's tons of those cards in the game, and people read them, they get excited, but they just kind of flop. Not in this case for the added clause in which it can go ahead and make it so that the mana pool is then drained. Any excess mana that's been sitting there is now yours, especially as something like Kruphix, God of Horizons out there, you can really potentially take even more mana from them than they can actually want you to have.
Yeah, I've said it before, and I'll say it again. Mana Drain is probably one of the most broken cards in all of Magic, and this is Mana Drain on a creature. That's really good, even if you don't end up getting the mana that is stolen, which is totally possible. All your opponent would have to do is tap out all their lands before the combat step. However, shutting them out like that is still really good, because then they can't mess around with your combat or even with the rest of your turn. This thing can come out early and start almost locking down other people and put you way ahead if they're not careful. The only thing is, it does need some sort of evasion to really be good in the long game.
We really get into it in our segment in Visions about how you can add such strong evasive onto this creature, and there's even commanders that can go ahead and make it so that this is even more of a force to be reckoned with. So if you're interested in this card and how to actually really abuse it, check it out. Now, Kyle, this is a very cool set you're bringing up because we're actually going back to Dominaria. Tell us a little bit about this Taste of Invasion.
Yes, we are indeed going back to Invasion for my next card. Number 3 on my list of our top favorite hidden gems is Washout. This had to be on my list, and you knew it had to be, because it goes in almost every single one of my decks that can play it. It's a sorcery, and it's blue, and it costs 3 colorless and 1 blue. You return all permanents of the color of your choice to their owner's hands. I've gone over why I love this card so much in our Invasion video, but come on, this is one of Blue's best board wipes possible, and it probably is one of the best out there as well, period, just because it can be one-sided. White is the color that does board wipes the best, black probably secondary, and red maybe next in line after that. But for the most part, they're all symmetrical. Blasphemous Act, Rout, or Austere Command, or anything like that, and even looking at Decree of Pain or Mutilate or something like that in black, they affect all creatures on the board equally. Blue kind of has an issue permanently solving problems. It has options like Devastation Tide and Evacuate, but that just sends things back to the hand. They're just going to get replayed later on, so they do kind of continue to be a problem. Even Cyclonic Rift doesn't get away from that fact. But one thing Cyclonic Rift has that makes us all talk about it is that it can be one-sided if you spend a lot of mana. Washout is pretty much a Cyclonic Rift for 4 mana that I guess you can't play as an instant, but still, I think it's just as deserving of this kind of title. Think about a lot of decks. A lot of decks are usually either 1 color or 2 colors, and even if they are more colors than just 2, a lot of the cards usually share the same color. Washout can target just specifically the decks and cards and all permanents, mind you, not just creatures that are a problem, and leave all of yours intact. That's really impressive for just 4 mana.
You nailed it on the head, Kyle. Literally everything I was about to say, you just grabbed it. The best comparison that I love is Cyclonic Rift. It really is like its stepbrother. You can go ahead, cast it for half, and you'll get half of a Cyclonic Rift. Sure, but sometimes it isn't half, it's more, and that's even stronger. The only weak part is it is a sorcery versus an instant, like you said. But this is an 80-cent card, so having that in comparison to a Cyclonic Rift right now, yeah, if you need to save a little bit of money, this is something that you can save it on, and also be serviceable. If you want to swap this out down the line, you can, but this is a really strong card, and more often than not, I find more people keeping it in the deck after they've used it. So great find, great card, and great points, Kyle.
Yeah, definitely go out and buy your play sets of Washout now and give it a try. I swear, if you're a blue player, you will not regret it just because of the options that this gives you. And it can put you way ahead in the game pretty early on or even later on. It's good at all times, really. Speaking of a card that's good at all times, though, this one kind of is too, Stu, but in different colors here.
Yeah, and this is one that I'm just still shocked I've never seen played. So this is my number 2, and we're talking about the one that we found in 5th Dawn, Devour in Shadow. It costs 2 mana, and it's double black for an instant that reads, destroy target creature. It can't be regenerated. You lose life equal to that creature's toughness. So typically what you should be running in your mind right now is like, this is a little more mana-intensive Doomblade, and that is a fair comparison. But the thing that I love to compare this with on Doomblade is that this is not conditional on a type of creature. Doomblade is. So potentially that 2-drop, slightly easier to cast removal spell might not be able to do anything for you if they have an artifact creature out there or another black creature. I like to think of it as that this instant does not produce cannibalism because it will not tarnish another black creature and it will not tarnish an artifact creature. So being able to go ahead and make it so that you can get rid of the options where you couldn't before is really strong, especially if you're in mono black, because mono black does run Doomblade. I think it should inherently run this one. Yes, you do run the risk of losing some life and possibly even very big life for that amount, but it is toughness over attack, and the toughness we see is usually even to the attack if not lower, so it could be something that is not as one-sided as you initially think. And after running this card as a playtest, I'm not disappointed. This is a 20-cent card. And if you look at like big removal spells, kind of like Terminate or Dreadbore, that cost is a little bit higher than 20 cents. So this is a great budget option as well.
You mentioned a couple of my favorite removal options right there, Stu. I love Terminate. Dreadbore is pretty good too because it can also hit Planeswalkers, but it is also a sorcery. Terminate's probably my favorite removal spell of all time because it kills any creature and stops regeneration. Not that that really matters in today's world, but it's still a nice thing to have on there at times because some regeneration creatures do still pop up. However, Devouring Shadow has an advantage in that Terminate can only be played in a deck that has both red and black in it. Devouring Shadow can be played in more places. Sure, it also has that rider about you losing life, but especially if you're playing in a format like Commander, it's probably not going to hurt nearly as much as something really scary sticking around on the field. The reason I don't play this card as much is, as you suggested, I don't really have decks where I wouldn't just play Terminator Dreadbore over this, but certainly if and when I end up making mono black, I am obviously going to think about this as an include.
Remember, most dual-color decks do run Urborg to make it so every land is a swamp in addition. So filling in that deficit of the additional black mana really shouldn't hurt you, because more often than not, Urborg can be a combo piece in a lot of decks, and with this at the helm of that, oh yeah, you're not really falling behind at all. You're just gaining more footing.
Yeah, I normally like a few more options on my removal and some more bells and whistles, but this is a perfectly fine card and one that's so cheap. Absolutely, Stu. Budget players and probably everyone else too could use to take a look at it again. Speaking of things that I think everyone should use, I'm going to go to my number 2 card, which is Temple of the False God. This is a land from Scourge, and it has a very simple ability in that you tap it and you add 2 colorless to your mana pool. You play this ability, however, only if you control 5 or more lands. This pretty much, in my opinion, belongs in any Commander deck that I build, except maybe 5 color ones, because colorless mana can sometimes be an issue with that, just because of the pure mana acceleration that it provides. Think about almost any deck in Magic with green in it, you're definitely ramping. Red even has some ramp too in that big mana spell department and whatnot. But even colors that don't, like blue and black and whatnot, they have artifacts to do this for them. Wayfarer's Bauble, Sword of the Animist, they do exist and they are out there and people do use them. So the idea that this is too scary for you because, oh my gosh, I'm not going to have enough lands to turn this on when I draw it. No. You almost always will. I have rarely ever encountered that being a problem with this land, and just 2 mana from a land that comes into play and can be used immediately is just too good to pass up.
Oh yeah, I mean, you can see why Ancient Tomb is worth its cost because it comes in flat out, and it goes ahead and produces 2 mana, no problem. So this is a little bit more conditional, and like for cards that are similar to Sol Ring that we see with Palladium Mirror or even Worn Power Stone, they add a condition on it because having a second Sol Ring in a deck gives a certain color or a certain type way too much of an advantage. So it's a very fair land. It's vanilla. I mean, nothing feels worse to like you play 2 or 3 lands and now you're top decking for lands because you had the perfect hand and then you draw this. You can't play it for turn. Well, you can, but you just feel bad about it. You just don't feel like you got the value you needed. But beyond that, this is a great card, staple, and I love it.
Yeah, I usually end up mulliganing this away if I get it in an opening hand, but still, that almost never becomes a problem because if I have that in my hand with another land and a piece of ramp, I'm like, yeah, go for it. It rarely ever becomes an issue. So, as I said, I think this is an auto-include in almost anybody's deck, and it just feels so good to play this and jump up a whole extra mana on everyone.
Also, it feels good late game, because if you get this and you're falling behind, it can give you the option to catch up. I always remember when I play Rune of the Hidden Realm, I play this, and now I no longer have to worry about saving mana to use this tap effect. I just have 1 land that I just always leave to the side. I know not to touch it, and I can always get the blink effect off. So now we're moving right along to my final card on the list, and this is actually one of the hidden gems that we found in our first segment, and we are talking about a card from Arcadian Masks named Tower of the Magistrate, and it is a land. It produces 1 colorless mana for just a basic tap, and for 1 generic mana and tapping it, you can make it so target creature gains protection from artifacts until the end of the turn. So the reason I really love this card, and Kyle, I know you've debated it with me before countless times, but I've used it against you countless times, and I used it against a whole bunch of different friends. This is a land I throw in any deck I can that is 3 color or less, just for the sheer versatility that it gives me. Yes, I know what you're thinking right off the bat. It gives a creature protection from artifacts. Now you're thinking that's not exactly the best thing, right? How many artifact creatures are really on the field at one time, and how many things do artifacts truly target? And you're right, not necessarily a lot. But the key thing that makes this shine, and I've seen it disrupt so many strategies, is the fact that it totally alters with equipments, and equipments that have protections from colors, no less. So you see the swords of Fire and Ice, Feast and Famine, Body and Mind, and those have hard times being removed just for the fact that it gives the creature protection from those colors. This land is serviceable for the fact that you can either go ahead and, as soon as they pay the equip cost, target the creature and they just wasted mana that turn, or if they go ahead and they swing at you or a player that you do not want them to get the effect off for, you can make it so that it no longer is a threat, it's off of them, that to spend mana to re-equip it, and that creature is probably dead in the water. It's just saved me so many times in so many scenarios, and then even with the fact with vehicles being in the game now, it makes it so that you can now be safe from some sort of gargantuan thing that's sitting on the field that was no threat a minute ago.
That's true, Stu, and originally I did kind of poo-poo this card when it first came up and didn't really think it was all that great, but you only have to once have this used against you when you're trying to put a Lightning Greaves on one of your creatures, and it's just the worst and most annoying thing in the entire world, and it makes me flip out every single time because it just does not seem right. I would note, though, I normally only put narrow sort of utility lands like this in my monocolor decks because I usually want other colorless only lands to be something more useful generally, like a Ghost Quarter, for example, and I only put 3 or 4 of them in. But in a deck like your Hirobi deck that's mono black, or say another deck that's only one color like mine that have the Eternal deck, or maybe a green one like you saw in the Wanderer Bard, I generally put all the colorless utility lands into those that I can possibly shove in no matter what it is, just because why not? You're going to have a ton of basic lands anyway, and this is certainly a fine fit in there because you've proven to me how useful this card can be against equipments.
I appreciate it, Kyle. I'm glad I've taken you to the dark side on this land. But the one last thing I will note is when I first found this card, it was $1. It's up to 3, so some people are taking note of this. So if you want one, it might get reprinted down the line, or if you want a cheap copy now, could be worth picking up. So food for thought right there. But enough about lands, let's get back into creatures, Kyle, and I see yours is no exception of a creature at all. Shards of Alara, take it away.
Yeah, speaking of price, it doesn't get much cheaper than this, and it's kind of hard to beat for as good of a creature as this is. I don't think this is too much of a hidden gem per se, though, because I've seen everybody and their brother play this card. Number 1 on my list is Fleshbag Marauder. This is, as you said, Stu, from the Shards of Alara set, and it costs 3 to play, 2 colorless and 1 black, for a 3/1 zombie warrior. When Fleshbag Marauder enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a creature. This is a deceptively simplistic effect that you wouldn't maybe take much note of at first, but it's just such a great card because let's think about some non-creature cards that force people to sacrifice creatures. Take a look at a card like Diabolic Edict, for example, which was a sorcery from back in the day that forced target player to sacrifice a creature. I wouldn't play that almost anywhere because forcing a player to only sacrifice one creature of their choice, unless they have just one giant Voltron creature sitting there, which happens sometimes, but you rarely ever see something like that really happen, is just total garbage, and I wouldn't play it, especially when it's not on a creature's body. When it gets put on a creature's body, though, this is an entirely different story. Even though the effect is symmetrical and will force you to sacrifice a creature as well, just sacrifice this. I mean, the stats are decent, but not great. What are you really losing by just putting this out there? It may cost 1 more mana than something like the Edict, but it's totally worth it because then you can activate all kinds of different things. It's a black deck we're talking about here. You've probably got death triggers and recursion abilities to bring this thing back. You've even got things like Dictate of Erebos and Grave Pact that make this card just nuts. For every 1 you sacrifice, probably this guy, they lose 2. How great is that?
Oh, yeah, and especially the fact that it is a creature, is the thing that is the value on this card, no doubt about it. You have tons of other commanders even that go ahead and synergize with this. Shattergang Brothers is probably the best example. You go ahead, you make them sacrifice once, and then they sacrifice again with the Shattergang effect. It's just so powerful for the fact that it is a creature, and I don't think Wizards took note of that because they'd gone ahead and printed Merciless Executioner back in the con set. That's the same thing, and it makes it so that the whole singleton format of Commander is a little less singleton now. I don't think they realize what they've done, because now they've given Black another thing that everyone hates to deal with. So this is just something that's very strong, and you never want to see it being played against you, because as soon as you do, you're just dreading for something like a Martyr's Bond to hit the field, or Grave Pact, or Dictate of Erebos, like you said. So very strong card.
There's even another one, Stu, a 4-mana one from Return to Ravnica called Slum Reaper. So these continue to be printed, these same kind of effects, on creatures now. And as I said, I think that's the deal breaker here. Obviously, I guess we don't really have to talk about that sacrifice does get around indestructible and hexproof, so if the aforementioned situation does come up where you're facing down a giant creature that can't really be destroyed any other way, this card will do it for you, and so will a bunch of other ones too. But this one, I would argue, the most efficiently out of all the options out there. Just for 3 mana, it's just so cool, and this had to be my number one because if we're looking at overall usefulness and that I put into every single deck, it probably would have gone Temple of the False God. But this card is just one of my very favorites that has ever been made. Very deceptive being an uncommon, you don't really think that much of it, but such a role player, and I put this in almost any deck that can support Black.
Also, one last thing to note about this card is for the fact that it is a 3/1. Typically, you would care about a creature that is so fragile of a body like that, but not in this case. It's going to do the one thing that it really is meant to do. It's taking out one creature and then another. It can chump block if you need it to and take something out with it, because that is a lightning bolt inherently on a creature. It's 3 damage to that toughness, and a lot of creatures are susceptible to that. So it is an engine of death.
It's also in zombie tribal, so the number of ways to abuse this in that kind of deck are just too numerous to mention.
So that is the pool, and it is being closed up for the winter. But don't worry, we're opening up soon again with some fresh water, and we're going to go ahead and jump right into Lorwyn with our next segment, so stay tuned.
And if you like the toys that we played with today, let us know if any of them surprised you or could make their way into your decks. You can let us know in the comments down below, or check us out on Twitter at MTGTheCardPool. You can also reach us by sending emails to mtgthecardpool@gmail.com. I'm Kyle Robertson.
I'm Stu Galetta, and we'll see you in Season 2.